Something had gone wrong in the Brewer household, and everyone could feel it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. It started with a frisbee. Casey tossed it across the smooth green lawn toward his father, a hopeful, simple offer of a few minutes together. Dr. Brewer squinted into the California sun, made a face, and watched the red disc hit the ground and skip under the hedge. "Not today," he said. "I am busy." The screen door slammed behind him, and that was that. Casey stood there on the lawn, looking deflated. His sister Margaret had watched the whole thing from beside the redwood garage, and she felt the sting of it almost as much as he did. She offered to play instead, and Casey agreed, though without much enthusiasm. He shuffled over to retrieve the frisbee, and Margaret moved closer, already carrying the quiet weight of sympathy for her little brother. Casey and their father had always been close, always tossing something back and forth, always challenging each other to another round of Nintendo. But Dr. Brewer didn't seem to have time for any of that anymore. And it wasn't just Casey who had lost him. Margaret realized she had lost him too. He barely spoke to her. He hadn't even called her princess in weeks, a nickname she had always pretended to hate but secretly treasured, because it meant he was paying attention. They tossed the frisbee back and forth under the wide California sky, and Margaret let herself think about how strange it all was. Here it was the middle of winter, and the sun blazed down without a cloud to soften it, and she and Casey were out in jeans and T-shirts, like it was July. Everything about California still felt a little off to her, a little too bright and unfamiliar. The game itself was restless and snappish. A wild throw sent the disc sailing over Casey's head, and he planted his hands on his hips and refused to chase it. Margaret snapped at him. He snapped back. She reminded him he was 11, not 2. He informed her she acted like a 1-year. The whole thing had the tired, fraying quality of 2 kids who were really upset about something else entirely, and taking it out on each other because that was easier. They both knew what the something else was. It was easy to figure out. Things had been tense ever since Dr. Brewer started working at home, spending 8 or 9 hours a day down in the basement with his plants and his machines and his strange fluorescent lights. He came up for air so rarely that the household had quietly reorganized itself around his absence. Their mother had noticed too. She pretended everything was fine, but Margaret could see the worry in the lines around her eyes and the new strands of grey threading through her brown hair. After another few minutes, Margaret called it. She was hot, and the fun had long since drained out of the afternoon. As they jogged toward the back door, Casey asked the question that had apparently been sitting inside him for the entire 4 weeks since their father came home. "How come Dad got fired?" Margaret stopped. The question caught her off guard. They had never talked about it, which was unusual for 2 kids only a year apart who were generally pretty close. Casey wanted to understand. They had moved all the way out to California so their father could work at Polytech, and then, without much explanation, he was home. Casey half joked that maybe Dad had blown up the lab, and they both laughed at the image of their quiet botanist father standing in a cloud of smoke and scattered plant matter. But they both knew it wasn't funny. Not really. Margaret told him what she knew, which wasn't much. She had overheard a phone call, something about experiments that had gone wrong, something that had cost their father his position. Casey pushed back instinctively. Dad was smart. If something went wrong, he would know how to fix it. Margaret didn't have an answer for that. She only had what she had heard inside. Their mother stood at the sink deveining shrimp, looking tired and dry, humoured and a little overwhelmed. The phone rang and she went to answer it, leaving the 2 kids in the kitchen. And that was when Casey noticed something. The basement door, the one that was always pulled tightly shut when Dr. Brewer was working, was sitting slightly open. Casey reached for it, then stopped, then suggested they go down. Margaret hesitated for only a moment. 4 weeks of mysterious deliveries, strange equipment, rows of plants under artificial light, and not a single invitation. She reasoned, maybe a little hopefully, that their father was just waiting for them to show interest. Maybe he'd been hurt that they hadn't come down sooner. She pulled the door open the rest of the way, and they stepped onto the narrow staircase. "Hey, Dad," Casey called, excited now. "Dad, can we see?" They were halfway down when Dr. Brewer appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Under the cold fluorescent light, his skin looked strangely green, and he was clutching his right hand. Drops of blood were falling from it onto his white lab coat, slow and red against the white. He looked up at them, and his face was something neither of them had ever seen before. Anger, yes, but something more urgent than ordinary anger, something almost frightened. "Stay out of the basement," he bellowed in a voice that didn't sound like him at all. He was usually so mild, so soft-spoken. This was different. Both kids flinched and pulled back on the stairs. "Stay out of the basement," he said again, gripping his wounded hand, his voice dropping, but no less serious. "Don't ever come down here. I am warning you." The chapter closes on those words, hanging in the stale air of the stairwell. A father standing in his own basement, bleeding, furious, and afraid. Two children pressed against each other on a narrow flight of stairs, wondering what exactly their father has been growing down there in the dark, and why he is so desperate to make sure they never find out. The suitcases hit the floor of the front hallway with a heavy thud. And just like that, everything in the Brewer household shifted. Mrs. Brewer was leaving. Her sister Eleanor was in the hospital down in Tucson, and the two kids she was leaving behind were about to find themselves with a whole lot of house and very little supervision. Casey and Margaret shuffled in from the living room to say goodbye, their friend Diane Manning trailing behind them. Diane lived just around the corner and had been sprawled on the Brewer couch, eating potato chips like she owned the place. She offered to babysit, which made Margaret roll her eyes. Margaret was older than Diane, after all, and Casey, with the boundless confidence only a younger brother can muster, announced that he was smarter than both of them. But Mrs. Brewer was not worried about the kids. She was worried about their father. She told them to make sure he ate something. He was so deep in his work down in that basement, he sometimes forgot food existed. She glanced at her watch, called down the basement stairs for Michael, and waited. After a long pause, footsteps finally climbed up from below, and Dr. Brewer emerged into the hallway. He stripped off his stained lab coat and tossed it over the banister, revealing tan slacks and a bright yellow t-shirt underneath. His right hand, the one that had been badly cut 2 weeks ago, was still wrapped in a heavy bandage. He seemed impatient to get moving. He groaned at the weight of the suitcases and made a joke about how long she planned to stay, then walked right out the front door without waiting for an answer. Mrs. Brewer gave the kids one last helpless look and hurried after him. As the station wagon rolled down the driveway, Margaret stood very still and felt the loneliness of the house settle over her. It was a familiar kind of loneliness. For 2 weeks, ever since the day their father had screamed at her and Casey to stay out of the basement, he had barely spoken to them. A good morning here, a good night there, and then he would disappear back underground into his machines and his plants and whatever it was he was so furiously working on. Their mother had been the warm center of the house. Now even that was gone. Back in the living room, Casey restarted the movie he had already seen twice. Diane helped herself to more potato chips and sprawled across the couch with practiced ease. Margaret sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against an armchair, still thinking about her mum and her aunt and the strangeness of it all. The conversation drifted the way conversations do on lazy afternoons, from homework they were both avoiding, to riding bikes, to the math assignment Margaret had left at school. Diane was far better at math than Margaret, which was just one more thing in a long list of things Diane seemed naturally gifted at. She was also, as it happened, a science freak. So when Diane brought up Dr. Brewer and his experiments, her emerald green eyes lit up with a curiosity that Margaret recognized as trouble. "Try to mon," Diane said, jumping off the couch. Let's go take a look." "He doesn't want us down there," Margaret said firmly, and she meant it. She still remembered the fury on her father's face that day 2 weeks ago, the way he had shouted at them never to come down again. But Diane had already sized up the situation and reached her favorite weapon. She called Margaret a chicken. Margaret insisted she was not afraid, and even as she said it, she knew she had already lost the argument. Diane always did this. She had a gift for making you prove something you had no real desire to prove, by simply suggesting you lacked the courage to do it. Casey was no help at all. The moment he understood they might be sneaking downstairs, he clicked off the movie and scrambled to his feet with pure enthusiasm. "Hi, my," Diane said, like a general addressing her troops. "We'll take a quick peek. We'll just look. We won't touch anything. And then we'll come right back upstairs." And so Margaret, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, gave in. Casey grabbed the doorknob first, because of course he did, and pulled the basement door open. The three of them stepped onto the landing and were immediately swallowed by a wall of hot, steamy air. It pressed against their skin like a living thing. Somewhere below, electronic machinery buzzed and hummed in the dark, and off to the right, bright white lights blazed from Dr. Brewer's workroom, cutting through the dimness with an almost surgical intensity. Margaret told herself it was an adventure. She told herself there was no real harm in just looking, but as the three of them crept down the linoleum-covered stairs, she noticed that her heart was hammering in her chest, loud and fast, and a cold little tingle of fear had crawled up the back of her neck. She could not explain why. She only knew it was there, and it was not nothing. Yuck! It was so hot in there. The moment Margaret, Casey, and their friend Diane stepped away from the stairs, the air hit them like a wall, thick and suffocating, heavy with heat and moisture. Margaret gasped. Diane noted, with some amusement, that the dampness was at least good for your hair and skin. Casey, ever the student, wondered aloud if maybe their father was building a rainforest down here. Margaret could only say maybe, but her voice carried uncertainty, and something deeper than that, a quiet guilt, a creeping feeling that they were somewhere they absolutely should not be. The basement split into two large rectangular rooms. To the left, an unfinished rec room sat in darkness, the shadow of a ping-pong table barely visible in the gloom. To the right, something else entirely waited for them, blazing with white light, so intense they had to stand still and blink until their eyes adjusted. Large halogen lamps on ceiling tracks poured brilliant beams down onto a site. None of them had expected plants, dozens and dozens of them, tall and shining, packed close together in an enormous trough of dark soil, their thick stalks and broad leaves reaching hungrily toward the light. Casey cried out in amazement. Margaret stepped forward, breathless. It was like a jungle, she said, and she was not wrong. Leafy vines, tree-like plants with long slender tendrils, fragile ferns, and gnarled cream-colored roots poking up from the earth like bony knees. Diane asked, almost to herself, whether their father had really grown all of this in just 5 or 6 weeks. Margaret thought he had. She stared at a cluster of enormous red tomatoes hanging from a slender yellow stalk, and felt a strange mixture of awe and unease. Diane reached out to touch a large flat leaf, shaped like a teardrop, and urged Margaret to do the same. Margaret hesitated, reminding her friend they were not supposed to touch anything, but she gave in. The leaf felt nothing like a leaf at all. It was smooth and warm, almost like glass. The three of them moved through the bright, humid space, running their hands over the broad leaves and thick stalks, marveling at the strange fruits and impossible sizes of everything around them. Casey, overheated, pulled off his t-shirt and dropped it on the floor. Diane teased him about it. He stuck out his tongue, and then he froze. His pale blue eyes went wide, and he pointed to a tall tree-like plant nearby. "It was breathing," he said. Diane laughed. But Margaret heard it too. She grabbed Casey's bare shoulder, and they both stood perfectly still, listening to a steady, rhythmic sound rising from the plant, low and unmistakable. Diane rolled her eyes and made a joke about stuffed-up vines, but Margaret and Casey were not laughing. When Diane finally stepped closer to listen herself, the sound stopped completely, gone just like that. Margaret said it had stopped. Diane scolded them both, insisting they were just trying to frighten her. But there had been something there. They both knew it. Casey had already moved on. His attention had been caught by something across the room, past the plants. A tall glass case, about the size and shape of a phone booth, sat with a shelf inside at shoulder height, and dozens of wires running along its back and sides. A few feet away stood a second glass booth, nearly identical, with some kind of electrical generator humming between them, connecting the two. Diane hurried over. Margaret warned them not to touch anything, but Casey reached for the glass door on the front of the case, saying he only wanted to see if it opened. The moment his hand made contact with the glass, his whole body seized. He shook and vibrated wildly, his head jerking from side to side, his eyes rolling back. He managed to cry out for help. His body rattled harder and faster, and he screamed that he could not stop. And there, in that white blazing light, surrounded by breathing plants and humming machines, the chapter left everyone exactly where no one wanted to be, watching Casey shake, and wondering if anyone could reach him in time. Casey's whole body shook as if an electrical current were charging through him. His head jerked on his shoulders, and his eyes looked wild and dazed. "Help me," he cried. "Please." Margaret and Diane stared in open-mouthed horror. Margaret was the first to move. She lunged at Casey and reached out to try to pull him away from the glass. "Margaret, don't!" Diane screamed. "Don't touch him, but we have to do something," Margaret cried. It took both girls a while to realize that Casey had stopped shaking and was laughing. "Casey?" Margaret asked, staring at him, her terrified expression fading to pure astonishment. He was leaning against the glass, his body still now, his mouth wrapped in a broad, mischievous grin. "Gotcha," he declared, and then he began to laugh even harder, pointing at them and repeating the phrase through his triumphant laughter. "Gotcha, gotcha." "That wasn't funny," Margaret screamed. "You are faking it. I don't believe it," Diane cried, her face as pale as the white lights above them, her lower lip trembling. Both girls leapt onto Casey and pushed him to the floor. Margaret sat on top of him while Diane held his shoulders down. He kept crying out, "Gotcha," over and over, stopping only when Margaret tickled his stomach so hard he couldn't talk. "You rat," Diane cried. "You little rat." The free-for-all came to a sudden halt when a low moan rose from across the room. All three kids raised their heads and stared in the direction of the sound. The large basement fell silent except for their heavy breathing. "What was that?" Diane whispered. They listened. Another low moan answered them, a mournful sound, muffled, like air pushed through a saxophone. The tendrils of a tree-like plant drooped suddenly, like snakes lowering themselves to the ground. Another low, sad moan filled the air. "It is the plants," Casey said, his expression frightened now. He pushed his sister off him and climbed to his feet, brushing back his disheveled blonde hair. "Plants don't cry and moan," Diane said, her eyes fixed on the vast trough of plants that filled the room. "These do," Margaret said quietly. Tendrils moved like human arms shifting their position. They could hear breathing again, slow and steady, then a sigh, like air escaping from something alive. "Let's get out of here," Casey said, edging toward the stairs. "It is definitely creepy down here," Diane agreed, following him, her eyes still fixed on the shifting, moaning plants. "I am sure Dad could explain it," Margaret said. Her words were calm, but her voice trembled, and she was already backing out of the room behind the others. "Your dad is weird," Diane said, reaching the doorway. "No, he isn't," Casey quickly insisted. "He is doing important work here." A tall tree-like plant sighed and appeared to bend toward them, raising its tendrils as if beckoning them back, calling out to them. "Let's just get out of here," Margaret exclaimed. All three of them were out of breath by the time they reached the top of the stairs. Casey closed the door tightly behind them, making sure it clicked shut. "Weird," Diane repeated, playing nervously with a strand of her long red hair. "Definitely weird." It was her word of the day. but Margaret had to admit it was appropriate. "Well, Dad warned us not to go down there," Margaret said, still struggling to catch her breath. "I guess he knew it would look scary to us and we wouldn't understand." "I am getting out of here," Diane said, only half kidding. She stepped out through the screen door and turned back toward them. "Want to go over the math later?" "Yeah, sure," Margaret said, still thinking about the moaning, shifting plants. Some of them had seemed to be reaching out, crying out. But of course that was impossible. "Later," Diane said, and headed at a trot down the drive. Just as she disappeared, their father's dark blue station wagon turned the corner and started up the drive. "Back from the airport," Margaret said. She turned from the door back to Casey, who was standing a few yards behind her in the hallway. "Is the basement door closed?" "Yeah," Casey replied, glancing back to make sure. "No way Dad will know we—" He stopped. His mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. His face went pale. "My T-shirt!" Casey exclaimed, slapping his bare chest. "I left it in the basement." There is a clock ticking in this chapter, and every second brings danger a little closer to the door. Casey and Margaret had done something they were not supposed to do. They had slipped down into their father's basement workroom and taken a peek at his plants. And now Dr. Brewer's car was rolling up the driveway. And Casey had left something behind, and the whole careful secret was about to unravel. Casey had his hand on the basement doorknob, his voice climbing into that high, desperate register that only real panic can produce. He had to go back. He had to get it. But Margaret stood frozen in the narrow hallway, her eyes locked on the front door, watching their father step out of the car. She told Casey it was too late. She told him no. She reminded him that their dad was not going to kill them, just for sneaking a look at his plants, even if he had been furious the last time. Then something shifted. Margaret moved closer to the screen door and squinted into the afternoon light. Their neighbor, Mr. Henry, had appeared in the driveway. He had stopped their father, and the two men were standing together, talking. It was a small miracle, and Margaret knew it. She spun around and waved Casey downstairs with both hands. "Go," she told him, "fast." Casey flung the basement door open with a loud cry and disappeared into the dark below. Margaret heard him clumping down the stairs, heard his footsteps fade as he ran deeper into the workroom. Then she turned back to stand guard at the front door, watching her father shade his eyes from the sun while Mr. Henry talked at him. She knew her father well. He never lingered with the neighbors. Mr. Henry was not handy the way Dr. Brewer was, and so he was always coming over to ask for help fixing or installing something. Her father was nodding now, wearing that tight, polite smile that meant he wanted the conversation to end. She urged Casey silently, willing him to move faster, to grab whatever he had dropped and run back up before their window of luck slammed shut. But then Dr. Brewer gave Mr. Henry a quick wave, and both men turned and walked toward their homes. Margaret felt the urgency spike inside her chest. Casey should have been back by now. It did not take this long to pick a T-shirt up off the floor and run up a single flight of stairs. Her father was on the front walk. He saw her in the doorway and waved. She waved back, and her smile felt hollow, because behind her there was nothing but silence. She called Casey's name. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. Her father crouched down at the rose bushes near the front walk, fussing with the soil at their roots, buying her a few more precious seconds. But those seconds were running out, and Casey had not made a sound. A cold, heavy feeling settled over Margaret then, the kind that does not come from logic, but from something deeper and older. Something was wrong. She did not want to go down there, but she understood, with a certainty that left no room for argument, that she had no choice. She had to go into the basement and find out what was keeping her brother. Casey flew down the stairs, gripping the metal banister and leaping 2 steps at a time, landing hard on the cement floor below. He darted into the plant room, that strange blazing chamber where the lights burned brighter than daylight itself. He stopped at the entrance and waited for his eyes to adjust, pulling in a long breath of thick, steamy air. The heat pressed against him like a living thing. His back itched. The back of his neck prickled with warning. The plants stood in their rows like silent sentinels beneath the white glare. And there, just a few feet from a tall leafy tree, lay his crumpled T-shirt on the floor. The tree seemed to lean toward it, its long ropey tendrils hanging down and loosely coiled in the soil around its trunk. Casey took one timid step into the room. He asked himself why he was so afraid. It was just a room full of strange plants. So why did he feel certain they were watching him, waiting for him? He scolded himself, pushed his fear aside, and took a few more steps toward the shirt. Then he heard it again. The breathing, steady, unhurried, unmistakable, not too loud, not too soft. Something in that room was breathing. His eyes fixed on the shirt. It was so close. What was stopping him from simply grabbing it and running? He took another step, then another. He flinched when a sudden low moan rolled out from the big supply closet against the wall. It sounded disturbingly human, like someone trapped inside and suffering. "Casey, where are you?" Margaret's voice drifted down from the top of the stairs, sounding impossibly far away. "Okay so far," he tried to call back, but the words came out as barely a whisper. She probably hadn't heard him at all. He kept moving. The shirt was about 3 yards away now. A quick dash, a quick dive, and it would be his. Another low moan leaked out of the supply closet. Somewhere nearby a plant seemed to sigh. A tall fern suddenly dipped low, its leaves shifting as if stirred by a breath. "Casey!" His sister's voice came again from upstairs, tight with worry. "Casey, hurry! I am trying," he thought desperately. "I am trying." He took 2 more steps and crouched low, arms stretched straight out in front of him. The shirt was almost within reach. He heard a deep groaning, and then more of that steady breathing. He raised his eyes to the tall tree. The long tendrils, which had been drooping loosely moments before, were now taut, stiffened, ready to grab him. "Casey, hurry!" Margaret called again. He didn't answer. Every bit of his attention was locked onto the shirt. Just a few feet, just a foot, almost there. The plant groaned again. "Casey, Casey!" He heard the leaves quivering all the way up the trunk. His fingers reached out. He grabbed the shirt. 2 snake-like tendrils swung out and wrapped themselves around his waist. "Ah!" he cried, frozen with fear. "What is happening?" "Let go!" he shouted, clutching the T-shirt in one fist and clawing at the tendrils with his free hand. But the tendrils held on, and they gently tightened their grip. He tried to call for Margaret, but no sound came out of his mouth at all. Nothing. He jerked his body violently and pulled forward with everything he had. The tendrils held. They weren't squeezing him, weren't trying to strangle him or drag him back. But they would not release him. They felt warm and wet against his bare skin, more like animal arms than any plant had a right to feel. He hit the floor, tried to roll away. The tendrils hung on. The plant let out a loud, shuddering sigh. "Let go," Casey finally cried, his voice returning at last. And then Margaret was beside him. He had not heard her come down the stairs. He had not seen her enter the room. She was simply there. "Casey!" she cried, and her mouth fell open as her eyes went wide. "It won't let go," he told her. "No!" she screamed, and grabbed one of the tendrils with both hands and pulled with everything she had. The tendril resisted for only a moment, then went slack. Casey let out a cry of pure relief and spun free of the second tendril. Margaret dropped the limp plant arm, seized her brother's hand, and they ran together toward the stairs. They both stopped dead at the bottom of the staircase. Standing at the top, glaring down at them, was their father. His hands were balled into tight fists at his sides. His face was rigid with fury. Something was wrong with their father. That much was clear from the moment. Margaret and Casey stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, shaken and breathless, waiting for Dr. Brewer to say something, anything. But the words that came were not the ones they expected. He stared down at them with cold, unblinking eyes, his fists balled at his sides. Margaret had just cried out about the plants. Casey had just told him, voice trembling, that one of them had grabbed him, and yet their father stood there in silence, as if the sight of his own children was something he needed to study from a distance. Finally he spoke. He asked if they were okay. They nodded together and said yes. Then came the words that landed heavier than any shouting could have. He told them in a flat and quiet voice that he was very disappointed in them. Margaret apologized. Casey insisted they hadn't touched anything. Dr. Brewer only repeated those same 3 words, very disappointed. Then he motioned them upstairs and turned into the hallway without another word. Casey whispered to Margaret on the steps that he had expected their father to yell. Margaret whispered back that yelling wasn't Dad's style, though Casey pointed out that he had certainly yelled the last time they had gotten close to the basement door. Still, whatever was happening now felt different from that. It felt colder. In the kitchen, Dr. Brewer sat across from them at the white table, his eyes moving from one face to the other in a way that felt almost mechanical, as if he were cataloguing them rather than looking at them. Margaret noticed it immediately. This was not the father she knew. The real Dr. Brewer was direct and open. If he was angry, he said so. If he was upset, he told you. But this version of her father sat still and revealed nothing. Casey asked what was going on with the plants. Dr. Brewer told him he would explain someday. Casey pressed a little, asking if their father could take them down and show them what he was working on. Margaret added her voice to the request, trying to sound enthusiastic rather than frightened. Dr. Brewer said he would do it soon, then stood up, stretched, and said he had to get back to work. He pulled on his lab coat and disappeared. A moment later, they heard the basement door close behind him. Margaret leaned against the table and told Casey that at least it seemed they were not being grounded. Casey said their father was sure acting weird. Margaret suggested maybe he was upset because their mother had gone to Tucson to be with Aunt Eleanor. She told Casey not to think about the basement. She knew it was lame advice, even as she said it. She went up to her room, missing her mother already, trying to study. But the image of the breathing plants, the tendrils wrapping around Casey's arm, kept pushing its way back into her thoughts. She told herself to focus on the good. Their father had promised to take them downstairs soon and explain everything. That thought made her feel better. It made her feel better right up until the next morning, when she came downstairs and found that a lock had been installed on the basement door. A week passed. The following Saturday, Margaret lay on her bed and talked to her mother on the phone. Mrs. Brewer sounded tired. She explained that Aunt Eleanor's surgery had not gone well and that there might be more surgery to come. Margaret felt the distance between them like a weight. When her mother asked how her father was doing, Margaret admitted that he barely spoke to them. She started complaining before she could stop herself. She said he never came out of the basement. Her mother told her patiently that Dr. Brewer had a great deal to prove to himself and to the people at the university who had fired him. He was trying to show them they had made a mistake. Margaret said that before he was home all the time, they had actually seen more of him. Her mother sighed. Margaret caught herself and changed the subject, mentioning that their father had taken to wearing a Dodgers baseball cap he refused to take off. Her mother laughed in surprise. Margaret told her they had called him Dorky, and he had not cared. They both laughed at that, briefly and warmly. Then her mother was called away, and the line went dead. Margaret stared at the ceiling and felt guilty for complaining. Casey was out with a friend. The house was silent. Her father was no doubt locked in the basement. She decided to go downstairs and find some lunch. She was not expecting to find her father in the kitchen. He was standing at the sink with his back to her, hunched over slightly, doing something she could not quite make out. She stopped in the doorway and pressed herself against the wall to watch. Dr. Brewer was eating. He was reaching into a bag on the counter beside the sink, pulling out large handfuls of something and shoving them into his mouth with a kind of desperate hunger. He chewed noisily and grabbed more, gulping it down, grabbing again. Margaret watched in silence, completely baffled. He never ate with them. He always claimed he was not hungry. But right now he was eating like a man who had not had food in days. He finished what was in the bag, crinkled it up, and tossed it under the sink. Then he wiped his hands on his lab coat and walked out into the hall. Margaret ducked silently into the living room, held her breath, and waited until she heard the basement door lock behind him. Then she crossed to the kitchen and reached into the trash under the sink. She pulled out the crinkled bag and looked at the label, and she gasped. Her father, brilliant and strange and increasingly unreachable, had been standing alone at the kitchen sink, devouring plant food. Margaret stood frozen at the kitchen counter, her hand aching from gripping the edge so tightly. She forced herself to let go, staring down at the half-empty bag of plant food she had dropped on the floor. The image she could not shake from her mind was sickening. Her own father, shoveling dirt into his mouth and gulping it down as if he needed it, as if he liked it. She told herself it had to be part of his experiments. But what kind of experiments could possibly require a grown man to eat mud? The bag smelled sour and foul, like fertilizer. She grabbed it, wadded it up, and threw it back into the trash. Then a hand seized her shoulder, and she spun around with a silent cry. It was only Casey, grinning and asking what was for lunch. Later, over a peanut butter sandwich, she told him everything. He laughed. She told him it was not funny. He laughed again. She punched him hard on the shoulder, hard enough that he dropped his sandwich, and she barely even apologized. Then it all came spilling out of her at once. Everything she had been holding in. She told him their dad had changed, really changed, even since their mom had left. He spent all his time in the basement. He was cold and quiet and distant. He never joked around or asked about their homework. He never called her princess or fatso the way he used to. Casey pointed out that she hated those nicknames anyway. She knew that. That was not the point. The point was that something was wrong, deeply wrong. And then Margaret said the thing she had been afraid to say out loud. Watching her father gulp down that plant food, she had the horrible thought that he was turning into a plant. Casey immediately jumped up, scraped his chair across the floor, and began staggering around the kitchen with his arms outstretched, declaring himself the incredible plant man. Margaret crossed her arms and refused to be entertained. He crashed into the counter, banged his knee, announced that Plant Man kills, and ran headfirst into her shoulder. She screamed at him to stop. He backed off and asked for another sandwich. Monday afternoon, Margaret, Casey, and their red-haired friend Diane were tossing a frisbee in Diane's backyard. The sky was bright and breezy, and for a little while things felt almost normal. Casey ran after a disc that sailed over his head into the row of lemon trees, tripped over a sprinkler, and the girls laughed. The afternoon had the easy rhythm of something ordinary. Then Diane asked what it was like to have a mad scientist for a dad. Margaret stiffened. She told Diane that doing strange experiments did not make someone a mad scientist. Diane turned serious and admitted she had been having nightmares about the plants in the basement, plants that cried and reached for her in her sleep. Margaret said she had been having nightmares too. Then Diane told her what her own father had said, that Dr. Brewer had been fired from Polytech because his experiments got out of control, and he refused to stop them. The university told him he had to quit, and he said he could not. Diane had heard something else too, that someone had been seriously hurt or even killed in his lab. Margaret insisted that was not true. She told Diane they would have heard about something like that. But even as she said it, she felt the ground shifting underneath her. She found herself defending her father, not because she was certain he deserved defending, but because he was still her father. Diane said she was just repeating what she had heard and told Margaret not to bite her head off. They played a while longer before Margaret called it a day. She and Casey jogged home through the familiar backyards, and Casey said something about wanting a lemon tree. Margaret told him that was exactly what their house did not need, another plant. When they pushed through the hedge into their own backyard, they both stopped. Their father was standing at the rose trellis, studying a cluster of pink blooms. Casey tossed the frisbee at him without warning. Dr. Brewer turned too slowly. The disc glanced off his head and knocked his dodger's cap to the ground. He raised his hands to cover his head, but it was too late. Margaret and Casey both shrieked at the same moment. At first Margaret thought her father's hair had turned green, but then she saw clearly that it was not hair at all. His hair was gone, every last strand of it, and growing from his scalp in its place were bright green leaves. It began with a baseball cap tumbling to the grass, and what it revealed beneath it would change everything. Dr. Brewer scrambled to snatch it up and press it back onto his head, but it was already too late. Margaret had seen, Casey had seen, and the image of those hideous green leaves sprouting directly from their father's scalp was not the kind of thing a person simply blinked away. Margaret's whole head began to itch just thinking about it. The nausea rolled through her in waves, and she kept swallowing hard, trying to push it back down. Casey had gone pale as paper, but their father smiled. He actually smiled, gathered them both under his arms, and walked them to the shade of the tall hedges along the garage, where he sat them down on the grass as though this were simply a family chat on an ordinary afternoon. He told them their mother had called. He told them he knew they were worried. And then, for the first time in what felt like weeks, Dr. Brewer really looked at his children. Margaret had stayed quiet too long, and her father noticed. He took her hand gently between his and asked her to speak. So she did, bluntly and without flinching. "Why do you have leaves growing out of your head?" she asked. "A side effect," he told her. "Temporary. His hair would grow back." That answer explained nothing, and somewhere behind Margaret's eyes she knew it. But before she could press further, her father shifted the conversation to his work, and despite everything, the explanation he gave was genuinely astonishing. He was not discovering a new kind of plant, he told them. He was building one. He walked them through the idea carefully, using Casey's allegedly enormous brain as a helpful example. Imagine. He said that you could isolate the tiny piece of a gene responsible for great intelligence and transmit it into other people, passing it down through generations. That is what botanists do with plants all the time, engineering stronger crops, more fruitful grains, hardier vegetables. But what Dr. Brewer was attempting was something far more unusual, something that had never existed and could never exist in nature. He was trying to build a plant that was part animal. The silence that followed was thick with shock. Margaret was the first to find her voice. She asked if he was taking cells from animals and putting them into plants. He nodded. He was breaking them down electronically, he explained, using 2 glass booths connected by a powerful electron generator. One booth sent, the other received. He was trying to transmit the right DNA from one side to the other. Delicate work. Extraordinary work. And he told them, with a brief and genuine smile, that he was very close. Then the smile faded. He climbed to his feet abruptly, said he had to get back to work, and strode away across the lawn. When Margaret called after him and reminded him that he still had not explained the leaves, he tossed a curtain over the question. "Just a side effect," he said again, "only temporary." And he was gone. Casey was thrilled. He walked back to the house, buzzing with pride about their father, doing something truly important and amazing. But Margaret walked in silence, and the silence was full of the questions that had never been asked. She lay on her bed that evening and let them surface one by one. A side effect from what exactly? What had actually caused his hair to fall out? When would it grow back? She could not stop imagining what it must feel like, those green leaves pushing up through living skin, unfurling against a person's scalp. She hugged her pillow tightly and knew she would have nightmares. And then there were the other questions, the ones she and Casey had not even gotten close to asking. Why had the plants in the basement been moaning? Why had one of them grabbed Casey? What animal was their father using? And the one question Margaret could never ask him directly, not without revealing that she had been spying. Why had she watched him standing over that sink in the dark, stuffing handful after handful of plant food into his own mouth? She turned these things over for hours, through dinner, through a phone call with her friend Diane, through homework and television and the quiet settling of the house. She told herself her father would not lie to them. There were just questions he had not answered yet, but the reassurance kept slipping. At 2:30 in the morning, she was still wide awake when she heard his soft footsteps on the carpeted stairs. She heard him pass her room and go into the bathroom. Water began to run, and she made a decision. She had to ask him about the plant food. Not tomorrow, not eventually. Now, otherwise she would turn it over in her mind forever. Every time she looked at him, she would see him gulping down that dark and horrible mush. She padded down the hall toward the thin sliver of light leaking through the bathroom door. He was standing at the sink with his shirt off, his back toward her, the Dodgers cap sitting on the toilet lid. Without it, the thick green leaves covering his scalp gleamed under the bathroom light. He had not noticed her. He was focused on his hand, carefully cutting away the bandage with small scissors and pulling it free. The wound was still open. Margaret stared at what dripped from it into the sink below, trying to make sense of what her eyes were seeing. He ran it carefully under hot water. He examined it, eyes narrowed, and when the water washed it clean and the cut continued to weep, there was no longer any question about what she was seeing. It was not red. It was not blood at all. It was bright green. She gasped. Her feet found the floor and carried her backward, but the hallway creaked beneath her, and the sound rang out like a thunderclap in the quiet house. "Who is there?" Her father called sharply. "Margaret, Casey." His head appeared in the doorway, and Margaret was already gone, flying back to her room, hurling herself into bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He had seen her. She had no doubt about that. She had been seen. And now, in the dark, she lay very still and listened for his footsteps coming down the hall. Margaret pulled the covers up to her chin, trembling, her whole body shaking and chilled. She held her breath and listened. She could still hear water splashing into the bathroom sink, but no footsteps. He wasn't coming after her. She let out a long, silent sigh and asked herself how she could have been so terrified of her own father. Terrified. It was the first time the word had fully crossed her mind. But sitting there in bed, shaking so violently, gripping the covers so hard, listening for his approaching footsteps, Margaret knew that was exactly what she was, terrified of her own father. If only Mom were home, she thought. Without thinking, she reached for the phone. She had the idea in her head to call her mother, wake her up, tell her to come home as fast as she could. Tell her something terrible was happening to Dad, that he was changing, that he was acting so strange. She glanced at the clock. 2:43. Number she couldn't do that. Her poor mother was having such a terrible time in Tucson trying to care for her sister. Margaret couldn't frighten her like that. Besides, what could she even say? How could she explain to her mother how she had become terrified of her own father? Mrs. Brewer would just tell her to calm down, that her father still loved her, that he would never harm her, that he was just caught up in his work, caught up he had leaves growing out of his head, he was eating dirt, and his blood was green. She heard the water in the sink shut off. She heard the bathroom light click off. Then she heard her father pad slowly to his room at the end of the hall. Margaret relaxed a little, slid down in the bed, and loosened her grip on the blankets. She closed her eyes and tried to clear her mind. She tried counting sheep. That never worked. She tried counting to 1,000. At 375, she sat up. Her head throbbed. Her mouth was as dry as cotton. She decided to go downstairs and get a drink of cold water from the refrigerator. I am going to be a wreck tomorrow, she thought, making her way silently through the hall and down the stairs. It is tomorrow, she corrected herself. The kitchen floor creaked beneath her bare feet. The refrigerator motor clicked on noisily, startling her. Be cool, she told herself. You have got to be cool. She had opened the refrigerator and was reaching for the water bottle when a hand grabbed her shoulder. "Aye," she cried out, and dropped the open bottle onto the floor. Ice-cold water puddled around her feet. She leapt back, but her feet were already soaked. "Casey, you scared me," she exclaimed. "What are you doing up? What are you doing up?" he replied, half asleep, his blonde hair matted against his forehead. "I couldn't sleep. Help me mop up this water." "I didn't spill it," he said, backing away. "You mop it up." "You made me spill it," Margaret declared shrilly. She grabbed a roll of paper towels off the counter and handed him a wad of them. "Come on, hurry." They both got down on their knees and, by the light from the refrigerator, began mopping up the cold water. "I just keep thinking about things," Casey said, tossing a soaking wad of paper towel onto the counter. "That is why I can't sleep." "Me, too," Margaret said, frowning. She started to say something else, but a sound from the hallway stopped her cold. It was a plaintive cry, a moan filled with sadness. Margaret gasped and stopped dabbing at the water. What was that? Casey's eyes filled with fear. They heard it again, such a sad sound, like a plea, a mournful plea. "It is coming from the basement," Margaret said. "Do you think it is a plant?" Casey asked very quietly. "Do you think it is one of Dad's plants?" Margaret didn't answer. She crouched on her knees, not moving, just listening. Another moan came, softer this time, but just as mournful. "I don't think Dad told us the truth," she told Casey, staring into his eyes. He looked pale and frightened in the dim refrigerator light. "I don't think a tomato plant would make a sound like that." Margaret climbed to her feet, collected the wet clumps of paper towel, and dropped them in the trash can under the sink. Then she closed the refrigerator door, swallowing the room in darkness. Her hand on Casey's shoulder, she guided him out of the kitchen and through the hall. They stopped at the basement door and listened. Silence. Casey tried the door. It was locked. Then another low moan came, sounding very nearby now. "It is so human," Casey whispered. Margaret shuddered. What was going on down in that basement? What was really going on? She led the way up the stairs and waited at her doorway until Casey was safely in his room. He gave her a wave, yawning silently, and closed the door behind him. A few seconds later, Margaret was back in her bed, covers pulled up to her chin despite the warmth of the night. Her mouth was still achingly dry. She had never managed to get that drink. Somehow she drifted into a restless sleep. Her alarm went off at 7:30. She sat up and thought about school. Then she remembered there was no school for the next 2 days because of some kind of teachers' conference. She turned off the clock radio, slumped back onto her pillow, and tried to go back to sleep. But she was awake now, thoughts of the night before pouring back into her mind, flooding her with the fear she had felt just a few hours earlier. She stood up and stretched, and decided to go talk to her father, to confront him first thing, to ask all the questions she needed to ask. "If I don't, he'll disappear down to the basement, and I'll sit around thinking these frightening thoughts all day," she told herself. "I don't want to be terrified of my own father. I don't." She pulled a light cotton robe over her pajamas, found her slippers in the cluttered closet, and stepped out into the hallway. It was hot and stuffy, almost suffocating. Pale morning light filtered down from the skylight overhead. She stopped in front of Casey's room and wondered if she should wake him so that he could be there when she asked their father questions. The poor kid was up half the night. She would let him sleep. Taking a deep breath, she walked the rest of the hall and stopped at her parents' bedroom door. It was open. "Dad?" No reply. "Dad, are you up?" She stepped into the room. "Dad?" He didn't seem to be there. The air inside was heavy and smelled strangely sour. The curtains were drawn. The bedclothes were rumpled and tossed down at the foot of the bed. Margaret took a few more steps toward the bed. He was gone. He was probably already locked in his basement workroom. She realized unhappily. He must have gotten up very early and... She stopped. What was that in the bed? Margaret clicked on a dresser lamp and stepped up beside the bed. "Oh, no!" she cried, raising her hands to her face in horror. The bed sheet was covered with a thick layer of dirt. Clumps of dirt. Margaret stared down at it, not breathing, not moving. The dirt was black and appeared to be moist, and the dirt was moving. Moving it can't be, Margaret thought. That is impossible. She leaned down to take a closer look. No, but the dirt itself wasn't moving. The dirt was filled with dozens of moving insects and long brown earthworms, all crawling through the wet, black clumps that lined her father's bed. Something was deeply wrong, and Margaret knew it. She had spent the morning pacing the living room, her mind turning over everything she had seen, everything she feared, with nowhere to put any of it. She had tried banging on the basement door, timidly at first, then with real desperation, but her father never answered. He either could not hear her, or simply chose not to. When Casey finally came downstairs at 10:30, Margaret poured him a glass of orange juice and walked him out to the backyard, away from the house, away from whatever was happening below it. The sky hung yellow and hazy above them, the air already thick with heat, even though the sun was still low over the hills. Standing in the cool green shadow of the hedges, she told him everything, the green blood, the insects crawling through the dirt in their father's bed. Casey stood with his mouth open, the glass of orange juice held in front of him, untouched. He stared at his sister for a long time and said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, it came out barely above a whisper. "What should we do?" Margaret had no answer. She wished their mother would call. Casey asked if she would tell her everything, and Margaret said she guessed she would, even if their mother might not believe it. Casey admitted how scared he was. This was their dad. They had known him their whole lives, but Margaret pressed the truth that neither of them wanted to say out loud. He was not the same anymore. Casey grasped at hope the way frightened people do. Maybe their father could explain it all. Maybe there was a reason for everything, even the leaves. But Margaret reminded him that they had already asked, and all he had given them was the word side effect, which explained nothing at all. Margaret also admitted she had told some of it to Diane. Casey looked up sharply, surprised. She snapped that she had needed to tell somebody. Diane had suggested calling the police, which Casey rejected immediately. Their father had not done anything wrong, had he? What could the police possibly do? Margaret agreed, but Diane had said there had to be some kind of law against being a mad scientist. And that made Casey angry. He was not a mad scientist. He was just what? Neither of them could finish the sentence. They stayed in the backyard for hours, turning the question over and over without reaching any answer. Then the kitchen door swung open, and their father called them inside for lunch. They both stared at each other in surprise. He had actually come upstairs. When they rushed into the kitchen, Dr. Brewer was smiling, his Dodgers cap in place, setting 2 bowls down on the table, as if nothing in the world was strange. He told them it was lunchtime. Casey could not hide his astonishment. Margaret said they needed to talk, and their father said he did not have much time for that. He told them to sit down and try his new dish. The bowls were filled with a green, pulpy substance. Casey said it looked like green mashed potatoes, and made a face. Their father stood over them at the head of the table and told them to go ahead and taste it, that they would be surprised. He called them his guinea pigs, and said it with a smile that faded too quickly. Margaret kept the suspicion carefully out of her voice when she pointed out that he had never made them lunch before. He told her he just wanted them to try it, and something in the way he said it made the air in the room feel tighter. Their mother had called that morning, he told them. Margaret asked when, urgently, and he said just a short while ago, while they were outside. He said Aunt Eleanor had been moved out of intensive care, and their mother might be coming home soon. Both children cried out with relief at that, but their father pointed straight back at the bowls and told them to eat. Casey asked if their father would be having any. He said no, he had already eaten, and he leaned forward with both hands on the table. Margaret noticed his cut hand was freshly bandaged. She tried to bring up the night before, and he cut her off. He wanted them to eat. Casey whined that it did not smell good. Their father insisted the taste would be sweet, and he stared at them with something urgent and unreadable in his eyes. That was when the fear settled into Margaret like cold water. He was too eager, too desperate. He had never made them lunch before in his life. He would not say what the green substance was. He refused to eat any of it himself. And now he was staring at them, pressing them, almost commanding them with his eyes. She glanced at her brother and saw the same fear mirrored back at her. Was their father trying to do something to them? Would this green stuff change them somehow? Make them grow leaves, too. She knew how it sounded. She knew it was the kind of thought that belonged in a nightmare. But she was terrified of the bowl sitting in front of her, and she could not make herself stop being terrified. Then their father's patience snapped. He raised his voice and told them to pick up their spoons. When they still hesitated, he pounded the table with his good hand and screamed at them to eat. His voice filled the kitchen. He gave them no choice, no room, no exit. Margaret's hand was trembling as she lifted her spoon and slowly, reluctantly, raised it toward her mouth. Something was deeply wrong at the Brewer house, and Margaret and Casey could taste it, literally. Dr. Brewer leaned over the table with an unsettling eagerness, urging the children to eat whatever strange green substance sat in those bowls. Margaret raised her spoon toward her lips, and then, like a gift from the universe, the doorbell rang. Dr. Brewer huffed with irritation and lumbered out to the front hall, and the moment he was gone, Margaret dropped her spoon back into the bowl with a sickening plop. "Saved by the bell," she said. Casey was already whispering that the stuff was disgusting, some kind of plant food, and Margaret was already moving. She grabbed both bowls, and together the two of them rushed to the sink, yanked out the wastebasket, and dumped every last drop of the green slop into the garbage. They set the empty bowls back on the table, like nothing had happened, and crept into the hallway to see who had interrupted their father's strange little lunch. Standing in the front entranceway was a man with a tanned bald head and large blue-lensed sunglasses. He carried a black briefcase and wore a navy blue suit with a red and white striped tie. Margaret recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Martinez, their father's old boss from Polytech. Casey said he already knew that. A little peevishly, Martinez explained that he had promised weeks ago to check on the progress of Dr. Brewer's work, and here he was. He had gotten a lift since his car was in the shop. He sniffed the air as he said it, which was an odd thing to do, but nobody mentioned it. Dr. Brewer did not look happy. He stammered and scowled and tried to physically block the path to the basement steps. He said it wasn't a good time, that he wasn't ready for visitors. But Martinez put a hand on his shoulder and spoke warmly, reminding Dr. Brewer that it hadn't been his idea to let him go from Polytech. The board had forced it. He said he hadn't given up on him, and he wasn't about to start now. Martinez stepped right past Dr. Brewer and pulled open the basement door. He spotted the kids and gave them a cheerful wave, hoisting his briefcase like it weighed 2 tons. Dr. Brewer looked genuinely surprised to find Margaret and Casey standing there. He asked if they had finished their lunch. Casey lied smoothly and said it was pretty good. The answer pleased their father. He adjusted the brim of his Dodgers cap and followed Martinez down into the basement, carefully locking the door behind him. Back in the kitchen, Casey opened the refrigerator and wondered aloud whether Martinez might give their father his job back. Margaret told him not to be stupid. If their father was really growing plants that were part animal, he would be famous. He wouldn't need a job. Casey considered that and then asked if egg salad was really all there was to eat. Margaret offered to make him a sandwich. He said he wasn't really hungry. The green stuff had made him feel sick. He wanted to know why their father had been so insistent that they eat it. Margaret didn't have an answer. She put a hand on her brother's shoulder and told him quietly that she was really scared. She said she wished their mother were home. Casey said he did too. Margaret put the egg salad back and leaned her hot forehead against the cool surface of the refrigerator door. She asked Casey a question that had been pressing on her all day. Did he think their father was telling them the truth? About anything, Casey shook his head slowly. He didn't know, and then something shifted in his expression. a spark of determination replacing the uncertainty. There was one way to find out. He said, his voice dropped to a whisper. The first chance they got, the first time their father was away from the house, they would go back down into that basement and see for themselves exactly what Dr. Brewer was doing down there. The question was no longer whether something strange was happening beneath their feet. The question was whether they were brave enough to find out what it was. They had been waiting for their chance, and finally it arrived. The next afternoon, their father emerged from the basement with his red metal tool chest in hand, adjusting his Dodger's cap as he explained that he had promised Mr. Henry next door some help installing a new bathroom sink. Casey asked when he would be back, and Margaret caught the question for what it was, a little too eager, a little too obvious. She rolled her eyes. Their father said it would only take a couple of hours, and then he was gone, cutting through the hedges toward Mr. Henry's back door. Margaret and Casey watched him go. Then Margaret looked at her brother and said what they were both already thinking. It was now or never. She tried the basement door, locked as always, but Casey only grinned that mischievous grin of his and told her to go find a paperclip. Apparently his friend Kevin had been teaching him things. Margaret retrieved the clip from her desk, and Casey straightened it out, poked it into the lock, and within seconds was humming a triumphant little fanfare as the door swung open. Margaret shook her head. Kevin, she admitted, was a good guy to know. Casey waved her through first, and Margaret gathered herself, told herself not to think about it, and stepped onto the landing. A few moments later they were in the basement. Knowing what waited for them down there did not make it any less frightening. The moment they crossed the threshold, a wall of steamy, soaking hot air hit them both. The air was so thick and wet that droplets clung immediately to Margaret's skin. They stopped in the doorway to the plant room, squinting against the bright white light, and what they saw made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. The plants had grown, not just a little, but wildly, impossibly. They were taller, thicker, more plentiful than the first time Margaret and Casey had ever dared come down here. Long, sinewy tendrils drooped from thick yellow stalks. Broad green and yellow leaves bobbed and trembled, shimmering under the harsh light, slapping softly against each other with a wet, lazy sound. A fat tomato dropped to the dirt. Everything seemed to shimmer, everything seemed to quiver, as though the plants were not merely growing but reaching, straining upward and outward with some restless, living hunger. Long brown tendrils snaked along the ground, wrapping themselves around other plants, around each other. A bushy fern had grown all the way to the ceiling, curved over, and begun making its way back down again. Casey was genuinely impressed. He called it amazing, wanted to know if all these plants were really brand new. Margaret answered softly that she supposed they were, and the word that came to her was prehistoric. These things did not belong to any ordinary garden or greenhouse. They belonged to something older and stranger. Then they heard it, breathing sounds rising from the direction of the supply closet along the wall, a loud sigh, a low, rolling moan. A tendril suddenly swung out from a long stalk, and Margaret yanked Casey back before it could reach him. He snapped at her, told her not to grab him like that she had scared him. The tendril slid harmlessly into the dirt. Margaret apologized and squeezed his shoulder, reminding him gently what had happened the last time they were down here. He said he would be careful, and she believed he meant it. But the breathing was still there, steady, quiet, rhythmic breathing, moving through the room like something enormous, was simply resting among those trembling leaves. These plants were not normal. Margaret had known it before, but standing here now, feeling the wet heat press against her face, hearing that low and living sound move through the air, she felt it in her bones. She was still staring into that impossible jungle when it happened. Casey screamed, a sharp, terrified scream that cut straight through the thick air and stopped Margaret's heart. He was crying out that something had him, that it had him and would not let go. Margaret shrieked and spun away from the plants, desperately searching for her brother. Casey was crying out for help and gripped with fear. She took a few steps toward him before she spotted the small grey creature scampering across the basement floor. She started to laugh. It was a squirrel. Casey's voice was several octaves higher than normal as he sputtered that it had grabbed his ankle, that it had come out of nowhere. Margaret pointed to the frightened little animal and told him to look, to really look at how scared it was, that it must have run straight into him. Casey sighed, and the colour slowly began returning to his ash-grey face. He had thought it was a plant, he admitted. Margaret shook her head and reminded him, with just a touch of teasing, that furry grey plants were not exactly common. Her heart was still pounding hard in her chest. He had given her a real scare. The squirrel stopped several yards away, stood up on its hind legs, and stared back at both of them, quivering all over. Casey demanded to know how a squirrel had gotten down there in the first place. Margaret shrugged and mentioned that squirrels were always getting in, and reminded him of the chipmunk they once could not get rid of. Then she glanced toward the small ground-level window on the opposite wall. It was open. That was how the squirrel had climbed in. Casey shouted at it and started chasing it through the tangled plants. The squirrel's tail shot straight up in the air, and it took off running. Casey screamed at it to get out, circling the plants twice in pursuit, until the terrified creature leapt onto a carton, then a higher one, and bounded out the open window. Casey stopped and stared up at the window, catching his breath. Margaret told him good work, then said they needed to leave. They had no idea what anything in this basement was, no idea what to look for, and without knowing that, they had no way to tell whether their father was telling them the truth or not. She started toward the stairs, and then she froze, a bumping sound. She called out to Casey and asked if he had heard it, but he was hidden somewhere behind the thick leaves of the plants and did not answer right away. The loud thumping made Margaret shudder. It sounded exactly like someone banging on the closet wall. She told Casey they should check it out, but still no reply came. The banging grew louder. She moved closer to the shimmering plants and called his name again, and a tomato dropped to the ground so close to her foot it made her jump. Despite the heat pressing down on her from all sides, she suddenly felt cold all over. Then finally Casey spoke. He told her to come to him, his voice uncertain and worried. She hurried around the plants and found him standing in front of the work table beside the supply closet. The banging from the closet had stopped. She scolded him for scaring her and leaned against the wooden table to steady herself. Casey held up a dark, folded bundle he had found shoved under the work table. When Margaret asked what it was, he unfolded it slowly. It was a suit jacket, a blue suit jacket. Tucked inside it was a red striped necktie. It was Mr. Martinez's. Casey squeezed the collar of the wrinkled jacket between his hands and said so plainly, his voice quiet. Margaret's mouth fell open. She asked if Mr. Martinez had just left it behind, but Casey turned the question right back on her. If he had simply left, why was it bundled up and shoved back under a table? Margaret ran her hand over the silky striped tie and stared at it hard. Casey asked whether she had actually seen Mr. Martinez leave the house the day before. She had not, she admitted. But his car was gone, she said. Casey reminded her that Mr. Martinez had not driven. He had told their father he had gotten a lift. Margaret raised her eyes from the wrinkled jacket to her brother's worried face. She told him what he was suggesting was ridiculous, that Mr. Martinez had been eaten by a plant or something. But even as she said it, she could not answer the question he had asked. She could not explain why that jacket and tie had been hidden away like that. He never got the chance to try. Both of them gasped as heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. Someone was hurrying into the basement, and they were coming fast. Margaret whispered one urgent word, "Hide." Casey stared back at her with wide, panicked eyes, and asked the question that hung in the air between them. "Where?" Margaret threw herself up onto the carton and squeezed through the small open window, tumbling out onto the cool grass. That squirrel had turned out to be a friend after all, she thought, pulling hard on her brother's arms as Casey scrambled out of the basement behind her. It had shown them the only way out. The afternoon air hit them like a splash of cold water after the steamy heat below. Breathing hard, they both crouched down to peer back through the window into the white light of the plant room. And then they saw him. Their father stepped into view, his eyes sweeping the basement with a searching, careful look. "Why did Dad come back?" Casey whispered. Margaret pressed a finger to her lips and pulled him toward the back door. "No time to wonder. Just move." The door was unlocked. They slipped into the kitchen just as Dr. Brewer emerged from the basement, a concerned expression written all over his face. "Hey, there you are," he said. Margaret tried to sound casual, tried to keep her voice from shaking. She told him they had been out in the backyard and had come inside when they heard the back door slam. But their father studied their faces, and his scowl told them everything. He knew. He had come back for more tools, he said, and he knew they had gone down into the basement again because they had left the door wide open. Casey confessed quickly, glancing at his sister with frightened eyes. Then Margaret took a shot. She asked about Mr. Martinez, about the jacket and tie left behind on the work table. The question seemed to catch Dr. Brewer off guard for just a moment. Then he sighed and explained it simply. The basement had to be kept at a high, tropical temperature, with plenty of humidity, and Martinez had gotten uncomfortable. He had taken off his jacket and tie and set them down, then forgot them entirely when he left. Dr. Brewer chuckled and said Martinez had probably been in a state of shock from everything he had seen down there. He had already called him that morning and planned to return the things after finishing up at Mr. Henry's place. A smile broke out on Casey's face, and Margaret felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just a little. Mr. Martinez was fine. He was alive, and for one brief, wonderful moment she felt the full weight of how terrible it had been to suspect her own father of something so unthinkable. But the relief never lasted long. The fear had a way of creeping back in, quiet and stubborn, every time she looked at him. Dr. Brewer gathered his tools and headed for the back door. Then he stopped at the end of the hall and turned around one last time. He told them plainly not to go back into the basement. He said it could be dangerous. He said they could be very sorry. The screen door slammed behind him, and Margaret stood there listening to the silence it left behind. She turned the words over in her mind, unable to let them go. Had that been a warning, or had it been something else entirely? Something colder and harder, something that looked like a warning, but felt a great deal more like a threat. The morning had been golden, and for a little while everything felt almost normal. Margaret spent Saturday biking through the hills with her friend Diane, the sun burning off the smog, the sky turning a clean bright blue, wildflowers lining the road in red and yellow. She felt for a few precious hours like she had travelled somewhere far away from all her worries. They had lunch at Diane's house and drifted back to Margaret's place, with the whole lazy afternoon ahead of them. Then her father came backing the station wagon down the drive, and he was smiling, really smiling, something she hadn't seen enough of lately. He rolled down the window and called out the news she had been waiting to hear. Her mother was on her way home. He was heading to the airport right now to get her. Margaret could have cried from the relief of it. Someone to talk to, someone who could help her make sense of everything that had been happening, everything strange and unsettling about her father and what he kept locked away in that basement. She waved him off and floated inside on a wave of pure happiness. She and Diane flipped through old magazines and listened to music in Margaret's room until Diane suddenly remembered a piano lesson she was already late for. She bolted out the door, jumped on her bike, shouted a goodbye, and was gone. Margaret stood behind the house, looking out at the rolling hills, the cool wind swirling against her face, trying to figure out how to fill the time until her mother arrived. She decided to grab a book and sit under the old sassafras tree in the yard. She turned to go inside and nearly ran into Casey, who came rushing up breathless, asking about their kites. The wind was strong and perfect, he said, just right for flying. Margaret almost brushed past him, but she stopped long enough to share the good news. Mom was coming home. Should be there in an hour. Casey lit up, then immediately refocused. There was still time to fly kites, and he knew exactly where they were, down in the basement, on the shelves. He was already pushing past her into the house before she could think twice. Then the second thoughts came, and they came fast. Casey alone down there, in the plant room, among those strange reaching things that seemed to lean toward anyone who walked by. Margaret called after him and followed. The basement hit them like it always did, hot and steamy, the grow lights blazing. The plants shifted as they passed, or seemed to bending and reaching in ways that Margaret tried very hard not to think about. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the tall metal shelves at the far end of the room. The shelves were crammed with the clutter of childhood, old toys and games and sports equipment, a folded plastic tent, sleeping bags that had seen better days. Casey dropped to his knees and started pulling boxes off the bottom shelf, hunting for the kites. Margaret scanned the upper shelves. Then Casey went quiet. "Whoa," he said softly. "Margaret." She stepped back toward him. "What is it?" He reached behind the shelves and pulled something out, then stood up slowly with it bundled in his hands. It was a pair of black shoes and a pair of blue trousers, blue suit trousers. Casey's face went pale. He let the shoes drop to the floor and held up the trousers in front of him. Margaret spotted something right away. She told him to check the back pocket. Casey reached in and pulled out a black leather wallet. His hands were trembling now. He opened it and searched inside, then drew out a green American Express card. He read the name printed on it. He looked up at his sister, and his voice was barely above a whisper. It belonged to Mr. Martinez. This was Mr. Martinez's stuff, tucked behind a shelf in their father's basement, and neither of them could begin to explain why. Casey stared down at the wallet in his trembling hands, and the truth hit him like a cold wave. Dad had lied. Mr. Martinez might leave without his jacket, sure, but no man walks out the door without his pants and shoes. The evidence was right there on the floor, and it was impossible to ignore. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She asked what had happened to him, her voice barely holding together. Casey slammed the wallet shut and shook his head slowly, but he had no answer to give her. Then, from the center of the room, one of the plants let out a long, low groan, and both kids flinched at the sound. Casey said it again, like saying it twice might somehow make it less terrible. Dad had lied to them. His voice was flat and hollow now, the kind of voice that comes after a shock has burned through the panic and left something colder behind. Margaret cried out, asking what they were going to do. They had to tell someone, but who? The plant groaned again, as if answering her question in its own horrible way. Tendrils crept along the dirt. Leaves clapped together softly and wetly, like something alive and restless and waiting. And then the banging started again from the supply closet beside the shelves. Margaret stared at Casey, asking about the thumping. They both went still and listened. The banging was insistent, almost desperate. Then came a low moan from behind the closet door, followed by a higher one, both of them mournful, both of them unmistakably human. Margaret said she thought someone was in there. Casey suggested it might be Mr. Martinez, still clutching the wallet tight in his hand. The thumping continued, steady and urgent. Casey asked timidly whether they should open the closet. A plant groaned as if answering him. Margaret said yes, her whole body suddenly gone cold. If Mr. Martinez was in there, they had to let him out. Casey set the wallet down on the shelf, and they moved quickly toward the door. Around them, the plants seemed to shift and stir as the kids crossed the room. They heard breathing, more groaning, a strange scurrying sound. Leaves bristled on their stalks. Tendrils drooped and slid along the floor like fingers reaching. Then Casey cried out and pointed. Margaret saw it too. The closet door was not just locked. A 2x4 had been nailed over it. The thumping continued from inside, more frantic now. Margaret was certain someone was in there. Casey said he would get the hammer and edged his way toward the work table, pressing himself close to the wall to stay as far from the plants as possible. He came back with a claw hammer, and working together, they pried the 2x4 loose. It clattered to the floor with a loud bang, and the thumping from inside the closet grew harder and more desperate in response. Margaret stared at the lock and asked what they were going to do about it. Both kids were dripping with sweat. The hot, steamy air made it hard to breathe, hard to think. Casey admitted he had no idea how to unlock it. Margaret suggested they try prying the door, the same way they had pulled off the board. Casey shrugged and said they could try. He worked a claw of the hammer into the narrow crack beside the lock, but the door would not budge. They moved to the hinge side and tried there instead. Casey said it was not moving and wiped his forehead. Margaret told him to keep trying and said they should both push together. They dug the claw in just above the lower hinge and shoved the handle with everything they had. Margaret breathed that it had moved a little. They kept at it, pushing and wedging, the wet wood beginning to crack and splinter under the pressure. Finally, with a loud ripping sound, the door came free. Casey dropped the hammer. They both squinted into the darkness of the closet, trying to see what was inside. And then they screamed. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She gripped the side of the closet to steady herself as she and Casey stood frozen, staring into the long, narrow supply closet. What they saw inside made neither of them able to speak. The closet was full of plants, but these were no ordinary plants. Under the dim ceiling bulb, they bent and writhed, groaning and sighing and breathing, as if they were alive. Branches shook, leaves shimmered, and tall stalks leaned forward, as though reaching out to the two kids standing in the doorway. Then Casey stumbled backward into Margaret and cried out. One of the tall leafy plants had an arm, a green human arm descending right from its stalk. Margaret's eyes darted around the closet in horror, and she realized several of the plants had human features. Green arms, a yellow hand with 3 fingers poking from it, 2 stumpy legs where a stem should be. And then she and Casey both saw it at the same time, the plant with the face. Inside a cluster of broad leaves, a round green shape grew like a tomato, but it had a human nose and an open mouth, and from that mouth came the most mournful, heartbreaking groans imaginable. Nearby, another short plant had 2 nearly human green faces, partly hidden by its leaves, both of them wailing through open mouths. Casey grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled hard. He wanted out, now. The plants moaned and sighed in unison, green fingerless hands reaching outward, a yellow sickly plant making choking sounds, a tall flowering plant staggering toward them with thin tendril arms outstretched. But Margaret pulled her hand free. She had spotted something on the closet floor, half hidden behind the shifting, moaning plants. 2 human feet. She stepped cautiously forward. The feet were attached to legs. Casey begged her to leave. She told him no. There was a person back there, she said. Not a plant, a person. She took a deep breath, held it, and pushed through the closet, ignoring the soft green arms brushing against her, ignoring the hideous faces and the chorus of misery surrounding her. She reached the back of the closet and looked down. "Dad!" she cried. Her father was lying on the floor, his hands and feet bound tightly with plant tendrils, his mouth sealed shut with a wide strip of elastic tape. His eyes were wide and pleading, and he struggled to speak through the gag, making desperate, muffled sounds. Casey appeared beside her, looked down, and his face went pale. Margaret dropped to the floor and started to untie him immediately, but Casey grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her back. She spun on him, furious. Their father was right there. He needed help, but Casey reminded her, his voice tight with fear, that their dad had left for the airport. They had watched him go. Behind them, the plants seemed to moan louder, a terrifying chorus. One tall plant fell over and rolled toward the open door. Their father continued to struggle against the tendrils, his muffled cries urgent and desperate. Margaret moved to untie him again, and Casey grabbed her again. Then he told her to look at their father's head. She did. No Dodger's cap, and where their father's hair should have been, Tufts of green leaves were growing instead. She snapped back that they had already seen that. It was a side effect, she said. She knew about it. She reached for the ropes again. Casey refused to let her untie the bindings, but Margaret compromised. She would only remove the tape from his mouth. Just that. Nothing else. She tugged at the elastic tape until she got it free. Dr. Brewer exhaled with relief and told them to untie him quickly. He said he was glad they had come. Casey demanded to know how he had gotten there, since they had watched him leave. Dr. Brewer said firmly that what they had seen leave the house was not him. It was a plant copy of him. He had been locked in that closet for days. The words hit Margaret and Casey like a wave of cold water. The father they had been living with, eating dinner with, talking to, was a plant. Their real father said yes, and begged them to hurry, telling them their lives were at stake. He also told them that Mr. Martinez was in the closet too. Margaret turned and found Mr. Martinez lying against the far wall, also bound and gagged. That was enough for Margaret. She bent down and started working at the tendrils. Casey hesitated, then reluctantly bent down to help. Together they loosened the bindings enough for their father to slip free. He climbed to his feet, slowly, stretching his arms, bending his stiff knees, and gave them a grim, grateful smile. Margaret asked if they should free Mr. Martinez, too. But before anyone could answer, their father pushed past both of them and moved quickly out of the closet, striding across the room without a word. Margaret and Casey ran after him, demanding the explanation he had promised. He said he would explain, he would. But he was moving fast, moving with purpose, straight toward the woodpile against the far wall, and then he picked up an axe. He turned around to face them. Both hands gripped the thick axe handle. His face was frozen with something that looked like cold determination, and he started walking toward them. "Dad, what are you doing?" Margaret cried out, and the chapter left that question hanging in the air like a held breath, with no answer and the axe between them. Swinging the axe up onto his shoulder, Dr. Brewer advanced on Margaret and Casey. He groaned from the effort of raising the heavy tool, his face reddening, his eyes wide and excited with something that looked almost like hunger. "Dad, please," Margaret cried, gripping Casey's shoulder and backing up toward the jungle of plants crowding the center of the room. "What are you doing?" she repeated, her voice cracking with desperation. "He is not our real father," Casey cried out beside her. "I told you we shouldn't untie him. He is our real father," Margaret insisted, her voice fierce even as fear clawed at her. "I know he is." She turned her eyes to the man with the axe, searching his reddened face for some answer, some flicker of the father she loved, but he only stared back at them, his expression caught between confusion and menace, the axe gleaming cold and bright under the ceiling lights. "Dad, answer us," Margaret demanded. "Answer us." Before he could say a single word, the sound of loud, rapid footsteps came clumping hard down the basement stairs. All four of them turned toward the doorway of the plant room, and there, striding in with an alarmed and furious expression, was another Dr. Brewer. He grabbed the bill of his Dodger's cap as he moved angrily toward the two kids. "What are you two doing down here?" he cried. "You promised me. Here is your mother. Don't you want to come up and see her?" Mrs. Brewer appeared right at his side. She started to call out a greeting, but the words died in her throat. She froze in absolute horror at the scene laid out before her. One Dr. Brewer stood near the doorway in his familiar cap. Another Dr. Brewer stood bareheaded in the middle of the room, holding an axe in both hands. "No!" she screamed. "No!" Her face crumpled with terror. She turned frantically to the Dr. Brewer who had just brought her home. He glared straight at Margaret and Casey, his eyes full of accusation. "What have you done? You let him escape." "He is our dad," Margaret said, and the voice that came out of her was so small and strange she barely recognized it as her own. "I am your dad," the Dr. Brewer, standing at the doorway, bellowed, his voice shaking the room. "Not him. He is not your dad. He is not even human. He is a plant." Margaret and Casey both gasped and stumbled backward in terror. You are the plant, the bare-headed Dr. Brewer accused from across the room, raising the axe higher. He is dangerous, the other Dr. Brewer exclaimed. How could you have let him out? And there stood Margaret and Casey, caught directly in the middle, their eyes swinging desperately from one father to the other, from one face to its perfect mirror image. Who was their real father? 2 men stood in that greenhouse, each one wearing the face of the children's father, and only one of them could be real. The Dr. Brewer in the Dodger's cap moved into the room with urgent, warning eyes. The man was not their father, he insisted. The one they had just freed from the supply closet was a plant copy, one of his experiments gone terribly wrong. He had locked him away for a reason, because he was dangerous, but the other Dr. Brewer, the one holding the axe, shot right back. You are the copy, he growled, and he raised that axe again. Margaret and Casey stood frozen between the 2 men, exchanging wide, terrified glances. Their mother appeared in the doorway behind them, hands pressed against her cheeks, eyes stretched wide with disbelief, crying out to ask what her children had done. What had they done? Margaret turned the question over in her mind, even as her whole body had begun to tremble. They had gone down into that basement. They had followed clues and believed in their father and pried open that closet door. And now here they were, trapped between 2 identical men, one of whom was swinging an axe and screaming that the other had to be destroyed. The plants around them seemed to feel it too. Tendrils slithered across the dirt. Leaves shimmered and whispered. The whole room seemed to breathe with a dark, restless energy. Margaret's mind was spinning out of control, but one thought cut through louder than the rest. Her real father would never act like this. The axe-wielder, the one with wild eyes and a scarlet face, moving closer and closer, that was not the man who raised her. That was the copy, and she and Casey had let him out. She stopped thinking and acted. With a desperate cry, she lunged forward and wrenched the axe right out of the impostor's hands. He gaped at her, stunned. The axe was heavier than she had imagined, but she steadied her grip and swung around to face both men. "Get back," she screamed. "Get back now." Her mother cried out from the doorway, still too frightened to move. The capless Dr. Brewer reached for the axe, pleading that she did not know what she was doing, and made a wild grab for the handle. Margaret pulled away and swung it again. "Stay back. Everyone, stay back." The man in the Dodger's cap stepped forward, then, his voice full of relief, telling her they needed to get the dangerous one back into the closet. He held out his hand and asked for the axe. Margaret hesitated. He asked again, more insistent this time. She turned to her mother for guidance, but Mrs. Brewer could only shrug, helpless and shaking. Then the capless man spoke. His voice dropped low and soft, and he looked straight into Margaret's eyes. He called her princess. Margaret felt the word land somewhere deep in her chest. Her real father had always called her that. The other one, the one in the cap, never had. Not once. Did that mean the man they had freed from that dark closet was truly her dad? The man in the Dodger's cap lunged for the axe again. Margaret backed away, swinging it one more time. She kept warning both of them to stay back, her eyes darting from one face to the other, searching desperately for any other sign, any clue. Then she noticed it. Both men had a bandage wrapped around the right hand, both of them, and that gave her an idea. She told Casey to go to the wall and find the long knife hanging among the tools. Casey scrambled across the room, reached up on his tiptoes and pulled it down, then hurried it back to his sister. Margaret lowered the axe and took the knife. The man in the cap demanded the axe again, impatient and sharp. The man from the closet stared at her with a new expression crossing his face, something that looked almost like fear, and asked quietly what she was doing. She told him she had an idea. She took a deep breath to steady herself. Then she stepped toward the man from the supply closet and pressed the knife blade into his arm. The moment of truth had come, and it arrived on the edge of a blade. Margaret pulled the knife back, and there it was, red blood, trickling from the tiny puncture hole she had made. She exhaled with relief and handed the axe to the man she now knew was her real father. "He's our real dad," she told Casey, and those 4 words sealed the fate of the other Dr. Brewer. The man in the baseball cap cried out in alarm, insisting that Margaret had been tricked. But the real Dr. Brewer was already moving. 3 steps forward, the axe pulled back, and then the swing. The impostor opened his mouth wide, and the cry that escaped him was choked off almost instantly as the axe cut clean through his body, splitting him in 2. What spilled from the wound was not red. It was thick and green, and it puddled slowly across the floor. And as the creature fell with its mouth locked open in horror, Margaret could see the truth of what it had always been. There were no bones inside, no organs, just a stem, a plant that had learned to wear a human face. The body hit the floor with a heavy thud, and the green liquid spread around it like a terrible confession. Dr. Brewer flung the axe aside and pulled Margaret into his arms. "Princess, we're okay. You guessed right." "It wasn't a guess," she said, her voice steadying as she leaned into him. "I remembered the green blood. I saw it late at night. One of you was in the bathroom, bleeding green. I knew my real dad would have red blood." Then Mrs. Brewer came rushing in, and all 4 of them crashed together in a hug that felt like the end of something awful, and the beginning of something they had been terrified they might never get back. But there was one more thing to do. Mr. Martinez was still locked in the supply closet. By dinner time, the world had begun to resemble something normal again. Mrs. Brewer was finally home, trying to absorb the full weight of everything that had happened while she was away. Mr. Martinez had been freed from the closet, shaken, but largely unharmed, and he and Dr. Brewer had a long, serious conversation about the work that had been done in that basement. Martinez admitted he barely understood what Dr. Brewer had accomplished, but he understood enough to know it was historic. In his own stiff way, he offered Dr. Brewer a path back to the university. "Perhaps you need the structured environment the lab on campus offers," he said. "I'll talk to the board about getting you back on staff." It was an olive branch, and Dr. Brewer took it. After Martinez was driven home, Dr. Brewer disappeared into the basement for an hour. He came back looking grim and wrung out. He had destroyed most of the plants. He said they were suffering. He said he'd had no choice. A few normal ones he planned to transplant out back, but the rest were gone. Then, finally seated at the dinner table with his family around him, he told them everything. He had been working on a super plant, he explained, trying to use electronic processes and DNA from other plants to create something entirely new. Then one day he had cut his hand on a slide. He hadn't noticed, but some of his blood had mixed with the plant molecules he was working with. When he turned on the machine, the chemical reaction was unlike anything he had anticipated. His molecules fused with plant molecules, and what emerged was something that had never existed before. Part human, part plant. "That is gross," Casey announced, dropping his fork into his mashed potatoes. Dr. Brewer smiled patiently. He was a scientist, he said. He had not found it gross. He had found it extraordinary. Here he was, inventing an entirely new kind of creature. Margaret asked about the plants with faces, the ones that had haunted the supply closet like silent accusations. Her father nodded. Yes, those were his creations. He had kept pushing further, inserting human materials into plant materials, trying to discover how far he could go, how human he could make them. He could see that they were suffering, but he could not stop. The excitement of it had consumed him entirely. He paused and took a long drink of water, and then one day he went too far. He created a plant that was an almost perfect copy of himself. It looked like him, it spoke like him, it had his brain, his mind, but it was still a plant in certain ways, drawn to plant food, not quite complete. He wasn't perfect, Dr. Brewer said, leaning forward over the table, his voice low and serious. He had flaws, but he was strong enough and smart enough to overpower me, to lock me in the closet, to take my place, and to continue my experiments. And when Martinez arrived unexpectedly, he locked Martinez in the closet too, so his secret would stay safe. Casey asked if the head full of leaves was one of those floors. Yes, Dr. Brewer confirmed. The clone was almost a perfect human, but not quite. Then Margaret pointed out something that made everyone go quiet for a moment. "But, Dad," she said, "you have leaves on your head too." He reached up and peeled one off, making a face. He explained that when he had cut his hand, some of the plant materials had gotten into his bloodstream before the machine was even turned on. The chemical reaction had worked on him too. His hair had fallen out overnight. The leaves had sprouted immediately after, but they were already falling out on their own, he said, and he believed his hair would grow back. Margaret and Casey cheered. Mrs. Brewer smiled across the table at her husband and said she supposed things would return to normal. He said better than normal if Martinez convinced the board to restore his position. He planned to clear out the basement entirely and build the best game room the kids had ever seen. They cheered again. It was the happiest dinner Margaret could remember in a very long time. Afterward, they cleaned up together, and then all four of them went out for ice cream. It was nearly 10 o'clock when they got home, and Dr. Brewer headed straight for the basement. His wife called after him with a note of suspicion in her voice. He assured her he just wanted to deal with the rest of the plants. He wanted to make sure the horrible chapter was fully and completely over. By the end of the week, it seemed like it was. A massive pile of roots, leaves, and stalks was burned in a bonfire that blazed for hours. The equipment was dismantled and hauled off to the university. A few tiny plants were moved outside to the garden. On Saturday, the whole family went to pick out a pool table. The basement was going to become something wonderful. On Sunday, Margaret stood alone in the backyard, looking up at the golden hills. The peace of it settled over her like something earned. The nightmare was behind them. Her family was whole. Everything was going to be all right. Then she heard a whisper near her feet. She looked down. A small yellow flower was nudging against her ankle. "Margaret," it whispered, "help me, please, help me. I am your father. Really, I am your real father." The smile drained from her face, and the golden hills suddenly felt very far away.